Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. We have a fantastic show ahead for you guys today. A really special show, in my humble opinion, where every single segment is concerning the world of college football. To start off, we look at some Week 1 betting odds and some of the biggest games to start off the year. And then we have some special segments where we dive into certain teams and their win projections as well to see if they can overperform or to see if they will underperform. And I think that overall, this is going to be a great look into college football as the season is rapidly approaching. But before we get to any of that, I want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to not only the show but the network. It is greatly appreciated by all. Do also consider, if you do feel so inclined, leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters and ultimately the network as a whole. You can also leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you have about the show, and they will be addressed and answered at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let us get right into the show and right into the start of the college football season. We'll be looking at a Week 1 betting odds for the biggest games. We don't necessarily have that many big games to start off the year, but we have 3 in particular that I'm kind of keeping my eye on to see where certain teams are at. Some contenders, some teams with new head coaches, and some breaking in new players. It's a nice little amalgamation to start off the year, so to speak. A lot of teams trying to cement themselves in the race for the CFP. And let us start off with one of the games that I believe will tell different stories for both of these different teams right here. Clemson versus Georgia. Georgia is minus 135. The over-under is 47.5. And Georgia's money line is minus 600. And so, what I mean when I say that the tale of the tape is that these two teams have very disparate stories. You start off with Clemson. Clemson, program historically known for breaking in quarterbacks. However, over the past couple of years, they've kind of failed to do so. We see DJ Uiagalelei leave for Oregon State. He's now at Florida State now. And now they're heavily reliant on Cade Klubnik. Can he be the man to take them back to high heights like they were in the Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson eras? Now, when I look at Clemson, I can't all blame it on Klubnik either. Some of it has to go to Swinney and the way he's kind of fallen behind in recruiting. He's not necessarily gotten high-profile wide receivers to help Klubnik, and I'm also blaming the wide receivers. No one has truly stepped up to be a wide receiver one for Clemson. And so Cade Klubnik has had a rocky start to his career, not just due to himself, but others around him. This Clemson program is really in jeopardy of losing its luster that it's gained over the past decade or so. And when I look at this roster, you lose a lot. You lost Bo Collins, we'll talk about later. This is now in Notre Dame. And so you don't necessarily have guys who, in my humble opinion, would start on many rosters in the top 15 teams in the nation. And this definitely looks like a very daunting test going against Georgia, albeit at home. Whereas Georgia, they certainly have a lot more questions than, say, last year, when they had guys like Bowers, guys like McConkey, Rosemi Jack-Saint was a deep threat. They certainly have questions now as to who's going to emerge as their wide receiver one. Is it going to be Dominic Lovett? Is it going to be Rara Thomas? Or is it going to be even one of the tight ends that they have, Delp or Yarosek? But they do have the fact of the matter being a quarterback. Carson Beck is a steady, metronomic presence. He may not be the sexiest quarterback in terms of throwing the ball deep as other teams have in the top 25 or thereabouts, but he gets the job done and he does it well. He's consistent and he knows what he wants. And so I definitely feel like this game is going to be a Georgia win. However, I'm going to take the under here. And the reason being, both of these teams might struggle a little bit. Even Georgia. I think that, breaking in a new wide receiver core for a guy like Carson Beck, who's only had 1 year, with such a solid group of weapons at his disposal, it might be a bit challenging. But he does have Delp and Yurosek at his disposal, and Dominic Lovett and Rara Thomas have been with Georgia for quite some time, so they will know the system, and I think that this will be ultimately an easy win, maybe not as high scoring as people think. Let's move on to the next game. Notre Dame versus A&M. Two very similar teams, in my opinion. You have Notre Dame, third year of the Marcus Freeman regime, cycling through quarterbacks, land on Riley Leonard, who, while has been one of the more serviceable QBs in college football in recent past, has dealt with injuries, obviously last year against Notre Dame, suffering a thigh injury that kept him out all of last season. So is he even up to par? Then you look at their wide receiver core, it's an amalgamation of guys like Jaden Greathouse. You have Tyler Buckner, a former QB for them, converted to wide receiver. And then you have Mitchell Evans, who portends and profiles to be a breakout star for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish at the tight end position. But it just feels like this Notre Dame team doesn't necessarily have the depth and consistency of other top 50 teams. But they have an opportunity to separate themselves from, say, the lower end of the top 25 by facing an A&M team in transition. A&M is actually favored by 1. The over-under is 49, minus 115 money line, so they expect this to be a very close game, odds makers. And I think so too, because Texas A&M is, in my humble opinion, a little behind the 8 ball when it comes to retooling their roster. At least Notre Dame has had a head coach who has had some time with these kids. A&M, pick up Mike Elko. I like the hire, but it's going to take some time. I like Connor Wegman. I think that he's the quarterback that Texas A&M needs in terms of stability and longevity. He's had decent stretches when he did play last year, just under 1,000 yards. But at the end of the day, I'm looking at Mike Elko to immediately put a stamp on his identity. A lot of the recruits that Jimbo brought in, attempting to rebuild Texas A&M into one of those recruiting factories where it sees results on the field, needs to kind of transition to finding players who will stick with the culture that Mike Elko wants to build there. Not just high-end recruits who might just transfer after a couple of seasons if they don't necessarily want to follow the Elko plan. And so this just is a weird game to gauge. I would say the slight edge lays with Notre Dame here. Obviously, Riley Leonard might take a while to get going. Who knows how hard this injury is impacting him. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is transitioning from a guy who had such heavy control over the recruiting process, wanting to turn Texas A&M into a factory where it just cranks out high-end players, to a guy that's going to focus more on a culture of stability, certainly seems like it could fracture some of the relationships that are already in the Texas A&M locker room. There's a lot of more tension coming from A&M than I feel from Notre Dame. That being said, A&M at home, I think, can pull out a win. Kyle Field is one of the greatest environments in college football, as we all know. So it could be that home advantage that sees A&M over the hump. But I just think Notre Dame has that little bit more stability to their squad. And that's what I'm looking for in these two close-to-call games. And then let's finish with a battle of new quarterbacks who impress in small sample sizes. LSU and USC. Obviously, let's start off with LSU. Garrett Nussmeier, the ReliaQuest Bowl last year. 300 yards, 2 touchdowns. Had a couple mistakes, but proving that he can stay in this LSU system that requires him to throw the ball early and often and for that matter, far downfield. Whereas USC, a little bit of panic set in. Who is going to be the successor to the great Caleb Williams? Miller Moss stepped up. Fantastic bowl game as well. However, in this game, LSU is favored by 6. Over-under is 62.5, a lot higher than other totals. And the LSU money line is minus 205. And this is much more close to call than, say, Notre Dame versus A&M. Because these are two quarterbacks who aren't used to being in starting roles. This is the first full season we'll see of both Nussmeier and Moss. Both of these guys, younger guys. Miller Moss more so. But it's all going to come down to, I believe, the coaching. Which philosophy works best with their new QB? Lincoln Riley, obviously, known for building up quarterbacks. He did it with Baker. He did it with Kyler. He did it with Caleb. But not necessarily preaching defensive identity. Whereas Brian Kelly, with Jaden Daniels, really opened up and varied this LSU attack, making it a more vertical threat down the football field. Now the question comes down to, what are both QBs comfortable with? I feel that Miller Moss might actually be the more comfortable in terms of downfield passing than Garrett Nussmeier. I feel like Garrett Nussmeier is a much more anticipatory QB. I feel like he's going to pick and choose his spots. And this game is going to become one of those tactical battles that we rarely often see at LSU. How they pick their poison offensively. How they find the weak spots in the teams. That being said, I feel like LSU has a slight advantage because USC's defense might be a bit weaker than the LSU defense. And I feel that way because, talk about Lincoln Riley. Yes, you can bring as much offensive culture and build up as many quarterbacks as you can, but at the end of the day, you need an offensive identity. And LSU has some of the better defensive players in all of college football. Harold Perkins is an absolute stud at outside linebacker. And so, I just feel that right now, LSU, even though they might not have the better quarterback on paper at the very least, definitely feel like the better team. And they can pull out a win. I'm taking the over here. I think it will become a track meet. USC will stay in the game, but then they'll fade away and say the late third quarter, early fourth. That will just about do it for that week 1 preview in terms of betting odds for college football. I'm excited for the start of the season. Hope you guys are too. Coming next, we're going to switch to win projection previews for some teams, starting off with a team just recently moving to the Big Ten. Will they have troubles in their first year there? We're going to have to find out after the break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed that first segment. I'm very much looking forward to the start of the college football season. Before we transition to the win projection previews for some teams that I really like, I do want to remind you yet again to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network, and also consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. There's a huge support to all at the network, and will be greatly appreciated by me as well. If you have any burning questions, comments, or concerns about the show at large, you can you can also put them there, and they will be addressed and answered at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump into what I believe will be some pretty exciting segments. We're going to be looking at some teams and their win projections and how they profile. And so, I wanted to start off with a team that is kind of in a rebuilding process, which is surprising considering that they were a CFP finalist. Yes, I am talking about the Washington Huskies. The Washington Huskies last year were an offensive juggernaut centered around the play of Michael Penix Jr. and his three-headed wide receiver duo in Rome Odunze, Jalen McMillan, and Jalen Polk. All four of those guys are gone offensively. In fact, only 8 of 32 players with at least 300 snaps return to this Washington Huskies team. Now, the reason they're in transition is not just on the field, but off the field as well. They move from the Pac-12, where parity was key, to a much more competitive Big Ten conference, where they will certainly have some growing pains if they don't process quickly. Let's talk about the new look Washington Huskies. Not only are Michael Penix Jr. and his three-headed monster at the wide receiver position gone, they have a new head coach, Kalen DeBoer, leaving to take the Alabama job. Big shoes to fill following Nick Saban. They replace him with Jed Fish, a young, exciting, up-and-coming coach out of Arizona, led them to a top 25 finish. And they also needed a new look at QB. So what do? They pick up one of the more experienced, albeit more serviceable kind of QB in Will Rogers. Definitely not as electrifying as Michael Penix was, but he gets the job done. And perhaps that's what Washington needs in this kind of transitional year. Let's go to the defensive side of the ball. They lost a lot of production. However, their biggest strengths lie in both the linebacker and secondary positions. They return Cam Fabiculanan for his senior year, fantastic player at the safety position. They return Carson Bruner at the linebacker position. Both of these players had 75-plus PFF ratings. You also bring in a lot of depth. Cornerback Eli Jackson, Alfonso Tupolato returns as well. And Jeremiah Hunter is going to be your leading receiver at the wide receiver position. No more Rome Odunze. Jeremiah Hunter will be tasked. Had a decent season last year, 700 yards, I believe 7 touchdowns. Very impressive for someone who is not necessarily a star in that wide receiver group. So there's faith in knowing for Will Rogers, a guy who's going to have to live up to huge expectations for this Washington Huskies program due to the fact they place a lot of weight on his transfer. It's faith in knowing that Jeremiah Hunter at least had a decent season. But the rest of this roster is very young and inexperienced. And thus, that's why I believe that odds makers right now had them at only 8.1 projected wins. They have the 26th strength of schedule. Not terrible, but certainly something to look at in terms of how certain wins on their schedule will play out if they should be in the conversation to make the CFP. But looking at their schedule this morning, I definitely feel like they can hit the over if Will Rogers is just serviceable. I look at their first couple of games on the ESPN app right now. I look at their first couple of games: Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State, Northwestern, Rutgers. Most of them at home. In fact, 4 of them at home. Those are 5 easy wins to start their season. Yeah, they can just get through that schedule. They have 5 easy wins. They're 5-0, and then that's where it gets kind of tough. Week 6, they play Michigan, their first big, true test in Big Ten play. They do play Rutgers before Michigan, but Rutgers they should get past. Then I'm looking at 3 weeks after. They're at home to USC. Always a big game for the Washington Huskies. In the Pac-12, now in the Big Ten, it's going to have a lot, much more meaning. Should the Washington Huskies get past Michigan, their first true test? And I feel like they can't. Michigan also has a lot of questions. Who's going to be their quarterback? So the Washington Huskies, at least have faith in knowing that they have certain positions that other Big Ten teams are not solid on. USC, I feel like, is going to be the matchup that will most define this Washington team. Because should Miller Moss at that point have fully settled in at USC, this is going to be a very high-profile game for a lot of people. And at this point, like I said, if Washington is undefeated, this is the true marker of what will make them fantastic. Then, after that, you're looking at a road game against Penn State. It's always tough to go to that stadium, Beaver Stadium, one of the most electric atmospheres in not just college football, but in all the sports. All of those Penn State fans are going to be rowdy for that one. And then you're at home to UCLA. Should be an easy win. And then the big game to end out the year against Oregon. That one on the road at Autzen Stadium. So, at the end of the day, when I look at this Washington schedule, it's not as daunting as people think. Transitioning to the Big Ten could have been a much more difficult task. And I feel like they got the nice end of the stick. They didn't get the short end of the stick here. They miss out on Ohio State, which could be integral should they pass all these tests and get to the Big Ten championship game. Even if they lose, they could still represent the Washington, the Big Ten outside of, say, an Ohio State in the CFP. But let's not get past wishful thinking here. Let's still look at this team. When you think about not just the players that Kalen DeBoer had at his disposal, but the culture that they were able to create, the reason why it's one of the top scoring offenses last year, I believe third in scoring points average per game for Washington last year, is because Michael Penix was otherworldly. He understood what was required of him, and he understood the assignment every single week. I can't necessarily say the same about Will Rogers. Coming out of Mississippi State, certainly not the highest profile team. Certainly learning under Mike Leach, may he rest in peace, one of the great head coaches of all time. Obviously, being in that kind of Mike Leach air raid system should help him make this transition. But it's also about how Jedd Fisch is also making this transition. Jedd Fisch, obviously, last year Arizona, kind of happened upon Noah Fafita and Tetairoa McMillan. Fantastic wide receiver QB duo there. He's going to have to find a way to get a QB that might not be as comfortable with a deep ball to really open up this offense. Because that's what I think that Jedd Fisch was hired for. The continuity factor. You're losing someone in Kalen DeBoer who is willing to fling the ball downfield. You're losing also OC Ryan Grubb to the Seattle Seahawks, which I'm really excited for as a Seahawks fan. But getting back to Washington, you lose that. So Jedd Fisch really has the kind of feel of him similar to Kalen DeBoer. Now, let's look at the production that they lost, because they obviously lost a lot. Losing all three of your big wide receivers has to hurt. It has to. Because for Will Rogers coming into this new environment, much like several other quarterbacks, like it talks about Riley Leonard, you really want to have someone who might have had continuity and experience in this offense. Jeremiah Hunter brings that. But then after that, this is a very young, inexperienced wide receiver room that is really going to have to step up in certain situations. And so, looking at players like Jace Burton, Luke Gayton, guys who are just coming into this program, can they really be up to par? And so, even when you look at the schedule, even when you look at the games in hindsight, you also have to consider the fact that this is not the same Washington that it was last year. This is not the same Washington that's going to fling the ball down the field and have all three of their receivers be excellent at catching it. And so, I really think that this win projection total is too low. There is talent here on this Washington roster that could shock people, but isn't enough to carry over and translate to big wins. Oregon has continuity. Even though they have a new quarterback in Dylan Gabriel, they have continuity. USC, a little bit of continuity. They still have Lincoln Riley, and he might be the best coach when it comes to quarterbacks. Thank God you avoid Ohio State, who they have their own QB questions, but I think they're in a better place for continuity as well. And so, looking at Washington, not just in the context of the Pac-12, but now the Big Ten, things are going to get a lot more serious for them. And Will Rogers is a guy who I'm really going to have to keep my eye on to see how he improves as the season goes on. And he's also just probably a one-year rental. This isn't a guy who is going to stay in this QB room for some time. You're going to have to figure out after him who's going to come after him. So the future is kind of murky for the Washington Huskies right now. But looking at the schedule, there are definitely some places where they can pick up crucial, pivotal Big Ten wins and maybe find themselves as a sneaky dark horse contender to make the CFP as one of those teams that might lose its Big Ten championship game but can find a way in. And that'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we go from a dark horse to a juggernaut. Georgia we'll be talking about and how they will be definitely in the conversation for the CFP. We'll be right back to discuss them.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you enjoyed that last segment. I really think people might be underestimating the Washington Huskies, but we have to see it play out on the field. But now we are talking about a team that everyone is familiar with and everyone will be talking about in the CFP discussion because they are the juggernaut now of the 2020s. We are talking about the Georgia Bulldogs. And when I think about what Georgia has done to earn the respect of everyone in the college football community, I think about how Kirby Smart has set in stone the fact that, yes, he can recruit well, but he can also instill a culture in Georgia that really cements them as a team to be reckoned with, no matter who is playing at what position, regardless of whatever you think about their players. And so, without further ado, let's talk about the tale of the tape as to why Georgia will always be in the discussion for the CFP, in the discussion for most wins in the nation. Right now, they're actually projected to have a 9.9 win projection total, and I think that they could exceed it, but they do have some tests. They have a 15th strongest schedule in the nation. And when I look at this roster, yeah, you could say the wide receiver room is not as potent as it was last year, but there really is no true weakness. They are one of only two teams, one who we'll be talking about next, in the top 10 in all of PFF's position unit rankings. Getting all of these stats, obviously, from a PFF. But I think that when we talk about Georgia, and we talk about the aura that they present in college football, we also have to talk about how there are a lot of issues, not maybe internally, but externally with some of these players. Maybe, discipline is not preached as much, maybe that could seep in, but who knows. Georgia is always going to be Georgia. And let's start off the tail of the tape. Obviously, the guy on my screen right now, Carson Beck. A very calm, composed presence, like I said, at the QB position. Highest completion percentage in the nation last year. When I think about Carson Beck, I also think of him in kind of the Stetson Bennett mold. He's not a guy who is a sexy pick. He's not a guy who is going to force things. He's just a guy who gets the job done. But he gets it done above average as well. There are certain traits to him that show a true QB, and that's why he's also popular in mock drafts, going as the number 1 QB overall. Because combining all the traits that might be a little bit unpretty in a quarterback and making them stand out is really special to behold. However, like I said, he's breaking in a largely new wide receiver room with guys like Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas. These guys have been with the program, haven't necessarily had their chance to shine, and so I'm really looking for them to step up. Both of these guys have had a couple of good seasons, decent seasons, but in order to truly be a threat, Carson Beck needs one guy who can get yards after catch. I don't necessarily think Carson Beck is going to be a guy who's going to throw dots to wide open players 60 yards on the field. He's going to need someone who can make an impact after the fact. And so I'm looking at Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas as the top 2 receivers in this unit. Really step up. They have solid depth at the running back position in Branson Robinson and Roderick Robinson. But at the end of the day, Georgia's pass game is going to come into focus a lot more. That being said, you have guys like Oscar Delp. Fantastic future for him, I believe, if he can win the starting job over a guy like Benjamin Urosic. And like I said before, it's all going to come down to how this unit performs, I think. If Carson Beck feels comfortable throwing to them as well, will also come into play. But at the current moment in time, I really see no faults with 2 guys who have been in the system, a promising young tight end, and a Stanford transfer who's going to be one of the best tight ends in college football when it's all said and done at the end of the season. Let's transition to the defense, as you can see on my screen. The defense also has a couple question marks, but it's still Georgia defense. It's not necessarily going to be Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis level, but these are guys who can still perform. And the guy on your screen right here, Michael Williams, is going to be one of the vocal leaders of that defense at the linebacker position. I think that he's going to have a fantastic year for the Georgia Bulldogs. As many other defenders before him have done, I think that he's kind of gone under the radar in terms of that. And so, when I look at Georgia, the scary thing about how they have built their team is that continuity doesn't necessarily have to matter in terms of how this team is built. And it seems kind of weird to say that because they do have continuity at certain positions. But Kirby Smart is just so brilliant at diagnosing certain areas where he might want to beef up the squad that everything's okay. He saw the Brock Bowers as a weapon, and he said, what's the closest thing to that? Oh, I'm going to recruit Oscar Delp, add Urosic from Stanford. And so he's looking at certain pieces along his offense and defense to really see who he can trust and who he can't. And that's how he's building this team. But now, let's go ahead and look at the schedule. Obviously, I'm going to go through this one by one. I'm going to pull it up on my phone here and give it to you straight. But I'm going to say this is perhaps the toughest schedule for a presumptive CFP finalist that I've ever seen. So, without further ado, let me pull up the schedule right here and look at it. They start off with Clemson. We talked about that game. Should be a very interesting game for both teams. Then you have a cupcake. Then you're at Kentucky. I don't think Kentucky's going to be a contender in the SEC, let alone the CFP, but they're always there and thereabouts. But I think it's going to be an easy win. Then you get Alabama on the road. Alabama is certainly a team that you definitely want to be prepared for. Obviously, losing in the SEC championship game last year has got to hurt. Improved Jalen Milroe. Let's see how he does under Kalen DeBoer, and that continues. But I think this is going to be perhaps the first true test for them. Then you have Auburn, then you have Mississippi State, and then you have Texas on the road as well. Not one, but two true road tests for Georgia. And it's going to be a game where all their wits are going to be about them, especially on the defensive side of the ball, because Texas is going to find a lot of ways to attack you. Then they're at home to Florida. They're on the road to Ole Miss. They're at home to Tennessee. So, as you can see, Georgia is not being treated like the number one team in the SEC, let alone the country. 3 road games against perhaps the top 3 teams in contention for that SEC title, and let alone the CFP. That being said, if there's any coach that can navigate this, it's Kirby Smart. He's going to have a different game plan for each and every one of these teams. He knows that he's going to have to find ways to combat them. That being said, 9.9 wins is a bit wishful thinking here. I think that Georgia, the problem with them is that, say you lose one of those games. Let's say you lose to either Bama or Texas. That won't hurt you. I think that you will get to the SEC championship. It's one extra game. And so I think that they'll be fine in that situation, in that regard. But if you lose 2, and say Texas as well, or Bama have 1 or 2 losses already, then that might hurt Georgia. Then that might play into how they play down the road. Because out of all those games, the only 2 that will matter are Bama and Texas. And will also matter what they have done themselves up to that point. And so, in the grand scheme of things, while it's not as important to really stack up wins in such a way, because you feel that even as potentially a 3-loss team, if that happens, they lose all those games, you can still get into the CFP. You really want to place emphasis on not losing to teams you expect will be there and thereabouts. You definitely don't want to lose to a team like Texas in their first year in the SEC, looking to knock you off your perch. And so, Georgia, I'll be honest with you, are a very talented team. Sans Bowers, McConkey, Rosemi Jackson, what have you. But the big question is, can they eschew any off-field issues with the program, which I will not discuss, and can they really focus on the 3 big games that will test their character unlike any a team of this nature has ever faced? Bama's going to be a very difficult game with Jalen Milroe. Texas with a new-look offense could be scary. Ole Miss, Jackson Dart, man, he's certainly a QB to be reckoned with. And so, overall, I feel as if Georgia, should they win 1 or 2 of those games, should be in a good place. But the margin for error for Georgia, especially at the lofty standards they put themselves on, the lofty pedestal a lot of people view them on, there's very little margin for error. We'll just about do it for the segment. Coming next, we look at the other big contender from the Big Ten to make the CFP and make some noise in terms of win projections. Ohio State will be next on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are now transitioning from juggernaut to yet another juggernaut. This team is definitely going to be placed on the same level, same tier as Georgia. This could potentially be a preview of the CFP title game, Ohio State and Georgia. So, talking about these two teams is definitely very exciting. But let's look at Ohio State now. Now, to get to this point, Ohio State had a lot of trials and tribulations. They certainly felt like at moments in time they had the personnel to go all the way. They had the depth and experience to go all the way. But the situation was the game. They can never get past the game against Michigan. But now, with one of the most exciting teams in recent memory that they've assembled, Ohio State is ready to take that step. And the only question that I really have about them is if they picked the right quarterback. So let's look into the tail of the tape. And let's start off with that quarterback. I'm very familiar with this young man as a fan of the Big 12, as a fan of Texas, a former Kansas State QB, Will Howard. When I think about Will Howard, he certainly is someone who has a lot of good traits to him. He's built well, he's very anticipatory, he understands the game of football at a high level, and when I think about Kansas State teams in the past, these are teams that really elevated the talent, and Will Howard was a huge reason for that. However, in the profile of an Ohio State, is he really the guy to over-exceed all the expectations of what Ohio State was in the past? Is he the guy to get them over the hump? He certainly feels like he has the wide receivers and weapons to do just that. We start off with Emeka Egbuka, the number one returner from this wide receiver class, perhaps the best route runner we've seen in college football in recent memory. He certainly has the feel of a wide receiver one. He's been ready for quite some time, just had to sit behind some excellent wide receivers from Ohio State, like Jackson Smith and Jigba. And now he has the chance to really profile as the guy who has often been overlooked, but now has the opportunity to shine. And he just has to hope that Will Howard presents him with that opportunity. Then we look at perhaps the most talked about freshman from spring practices in recent memory, Jeremiah Smith, turning heads. Hasn't even played a single snap of college football. And yet, the way that Ohio State talks about him, he seems like the second coming of Christ. A lot of expectations are going to be placed on his shoulders as kind of the guy who really comes into his own this year. He doesn't necessarily have to be that dominant, but I feel as if they really want him to shine in a heightened role immediately right away because they're talking about him very highly. Then we look to another guy in sophomore receiver Carnell Tate, who also hasn't had a chance to shine. And when we think about how this whole wide receiver room is set up for Will Howard, you have the guy that you need in terms of experience when you're bringing in a transfer QB who's been in the system, who can help him adjust to the system, and you have the exciting guys. You have the eye-popping guys who are really looking to get going in their college careers in Smith and Tate, and I think that they will really focus on allowing Will Howard to just be loose and be free and have what it takes to be the Ohio State QB, because right now it might not take that much to really be the Ohio State QB. Then we switch to the defense. The Ohio State defense is always come into question for kind of underperforming and underwhelming in big situations, but they certainly have one of the most experienced groups in the country, especially at the linebacker position. And it starts with JT Tuimoloau. This guy can play a lot of different roles. I love him. He's a nice little hybrid player. He can pass rush. He can be in coverage. He can move sideline to sideline. When I look at this linebacker core, it's one of the strongest in the country. You have not just him. You have Jack Sawyer, Tommy Eichenberg. Shout out Cody Simon, one of my classmates at St. Peter's Prep. So shout out to him. He's going to finally have a big role in that linebacker room. When I think about this Ohio State defense, a lot of people might be underestimating it just because of the fact that they haven't gotten over the hump against a team like Michigan. But let's just look at the stats. They have, like Georgia, top 10 depth in all the positions for PFF. I think that if Will Howard is serviceable enough, this team can win. Over the past 2 seasons, he had a 73.4 PFF grade. That's certainly not the best, but it's certainly something to work with. Let's think about last year for Ohio State and where it kind of all went wrong a little bit. You had a very similar player to Will Howard in Kyle McCord, who was very just focused on getting the ball to his biggest weapon, getting the ball to Marvin Harrison Jr. And so, will Will Howard have the confidence to do that as well? Or will he have the ability to do that well? And so, I really believe that right now, for Ohio State, as I'm going to look at their schedule right now, it's all going to be about the offensive side of the ball, because I'm not as worried in the defense as I've been in the past. I'm not as worried. I think they have a solid linebacker core, very versatile linebacker core, and I think that ultimately they will be the kind of bar setter for this team. When I look at the schedule, I see a couple games where they might slip up. I'm looking at week 6, where they're away to Oregon. They're away to the great Dylan Gabriel. They're away to a very solid team. Is also going to be in the Big Ten, if not the CFP discussion. Then they have another away game in 2 weeks after that at Penn State. Beaver Stadium, we don't have to talk about that stadium. Should they get past those 2 tests comfortably, and Will Howard is comfortable doing it, then I have very high hopes for Ohio State. Because you wait until the end of the season to play Michigan. And that game is at home. So, on your schedule, Ohio State fans, you only have 2 games before the game where you're going to be tested. They're both away games. One of the stadiums being perhaps the hardest place to play if you're a Big Ten team on the road ever. And if you can get past that, you're home free. Because I'm looking at, say, an 11-1 Ohio State team going into the game. And I'm looking at a 12-team playoff. While it certainly would be disappointing should they lose the game, because that's the game they circle every year on the calendar, you don't necessarily have to put as much emphasis into that game if you're, say, a one-loss team entering it. If I'm Ohio State, I'm kind of pushing all my cards into the previous games, because if I rack up the wins then, and say I lose to Michigan, it's always going to hurt losing to Michigan. You're still probably going to be the number 1 team out of the Big Ten in the CFP discussions. And it really also helps as the Big Ten becomes divisionless, because you're not having to worry about comparing your kind of thing with Michigan. And so, looking at those 2 road games, worry about them. Worry about Oregon and Penn State. Worry about another transfer QB in a similar position to your Will Howard and overcoming the atmosphere of Penn State. If you do that, then you're in fantastic position to be number one in the rankings, regardless of what Georgia does. That's the thing that I feel like Ohio State needs to pinpoint. I didn't even mention their win projections. They're 9.7 win projection totals. And they're 4th in PFF power rankings. I didn't even talk about the other addition they made at the running back position in Quinshon Judkins. So this really has the opportunity to be an offensive juggernaut, one of the best teams in this new look era to start off this 12-team CFP. That's the thing that I feel like Ohio State teams of the past have had trouble with. Staying true to their identity. They kind of lost themselves as seasons have gone on, and that's why they haven't really gotten over the hump in the game of late. That's why Michigan has taken control. You can say it's Jim Harbaugh, but a lot of it is on Ohio State as well. Why has a team that's had the talent and depth to beat Michigan, and soundly for that matter, not over the past 3 years? Now it certainly feels like the time for Ohio State to take advantage. But first, take care of business in those 2 road tests. Then you can worry about the game. If you take it one step at a time, then you can place emphasis on that. That's just about to do it for this segment. Coming up to finish off our show, we have perhaps the only major independent in contention for the CFB title. Another team kind of like Washington, who could be a sneaky dark horse. We'll have to see about them after the break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of the day on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And we really run the gamut on several fantastic college football contenders and even some dark horses, and this team kind of falls in the latter category. Our only major independent who's in contention for the CFB title. In their 3rd year in the Marcus Freeman regime, can they really solidify themselves as a team to be reckoned with a quarterback who certainly is one of the more experienced ones in college football, but has had injuries beset him in recent memory. And we are talking about the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Notre Dame is always an interesting team, not just because they're independent, but they really have to find a way to pick a schedule that really speaks to many different ways they can beat different teams. When I look at the schedule for Notre Dame, it certainly does not feel like a schedule meant to wow kind of the CFP voters. It's not meant to wow. It's meant for them to kind of look good and be an appealing option should they go undefeated with this schedule. And so, let's talk about why Notre Dame really has not really revitalized themselves after the Brian Kelly era, because they've had good moments under Marcus Freeman, but continuity might be the reason why they are so disparate in terms of teams like Georgia and Ohio State. There was a reason that there's a chasm between these teams right now. They're only projected to win 8.2 games this year. And like I said, their schedule has some tough games on it, I'll admit. But it's really not pretty. Let's look at their roster, though. I do like the look of this roster. I do like it. They bring in Riley Leonard from Duke. Like I said, injury last year, ironically against Notre Dame, to end this season, if he can come back and is serviceable. Can be someone who fits their identity as a team. He can be a guy who wills them to wins, much like Ian Book did when they reached the CFP, surprisingly. I don't necessarily think Riley Leonard has to be the star that people think he was at Duke, and right now, that's where I believe Notre Dame is in terms of their rebuild. Riley Leonard is not going to be here for a long time. You're going to have to figure out. They do have a promising youngster in C.J. Carr, who I really like, and if they redshirt him, he's going to be someone who I'm looking for. But when I look at this team, I really think their depth lies in the wide receiver room because they don't really have a wide receiver one. They just have so many very well-rounded and balanced players. When I look at Jordan Faison, Jaden Greathouse, let's see how Tyler Buckner does converting to wide receiver after his very weird college career where he's transferred to Alabama, started a game for them at QB last year, comes back to Notre Dame, wants to play lacrosse, how it all fits together. And then transfer from Clemson, Bo Collins, we talked about a little bit on the show before. I really think the profile of this Notre Dame wide receiver room is more physical and gritty than it has been in the past. They don't have one standout wide receiver who I can pinpoint and say, this is going to be the guy. But that could be a blessing in disguise for them. I think that Riley Leonard at Duke learned to distribute the wealth, and that's how he became what he has become, and it's the reason why Notre Dame was willing to take a flyer on him in the transfer portal. Then I look at their tight end, Mitchell Evans. A lot of people are going to talk about him as the year goes on. And so I think that should all of this come together, should this offense really find its identity and really develop a culture, should all of these players revolve around Riley Leonard and really help him transition, because all of them have experience somewhat in this system. If all of them can really help them make a statement, then maybe all of their ugly wins be represented well in the CFP. Say if some of these teams they're playing break into the high end of the top 25, say the top 15, top 10, then Notre Dame is going to have to be in the reckoning. Now look at their defense. They have a lot of depth there as well. I really like how they predicate themselves on coverage. I think their safeties are excellent. I really think that the profile of this team is going to come from the physicality in the secondary. Benjamin Morrison is going to be a stud. I think he's going to be a high draft pick, much like Kyle Hamilton was from that secondary. And so I really think that Notre Dame, if we compare them to other dark horses around them, kind of are in the higher level. And let's look at the schedule. They start off, like we said, with Texas A&M. That's a crapshoot of a game. We don't know what Texas A&M's situation is like either. And so, if they win that game, it's a solid marker for where they are, but really not a test. You have a lot of cupcakes in there. You have Northern Illinois after this game. You have Miami of Ohio, should be an easy win. You have Purdue. You have Stanford. You have Georgia Tech, should be relatively comfortable victories. Then you face Florida State at home. That's a high-profile game. FSU, all the rumblings about them being uncomfortable in the ACC. DJ Youngalola coming in as their new QB. Is he really going to be as good as people think he is? That's an opportunity to pounce. That's an opportunity to, should Florida State actually profile as a team that's in the top 25 or thereabouts, this is a good game to truly kind of prove yourself to the committee that as an independent, you can still play against these high-end opposition and kind of shock the world. And then, of course, the last game of the season is going to be away at USC. And USC is going to be a tough game, regardless of how Miller Moss pans out this season. So when I look at the schedule, I look at the Texas A&M game, I look at the Florida State game, and I look at the USC game. All of these other games in their schedule mean nothing to me. If I'm on the committee and I'm looking at Notre Dame's schedule compared to Georgia's, compared to Texas's, compared to Bama's, compared to Ole Miss's, compared to other teams that might be there and thereabouts, like a Washington, maybe even a group of 5 team like a Liberty, is this really the schedule that strikes fear into your heart? Is this really the schedule that you want to place a lot of weight on in comparison to other teams who play tougher schedules? Think about that. You don't necessarily have the division, the conference to lean back on either. You don't have saying, oh, well, I played all my conference opponents. We played them tough. We had a couple bad losses in there. We only have 2 losses in the season. No. You only have those 3 games against, let's be real with you, 20 to 25. All right, I see Florida State, Texas A&M, and USC in the top 25. They're not top 15, top 10 teams right now. That's the problem. And when you look internally, Riley Leonard is certainly a guy that's going to have to be monitored throughout the entire season. Because I still think this thigh injury, or whatever injury beset him on that fateful day against Notre Dame, is going to impact him throughout the entirety of the season. It's not going to be an easy road for him either. Because as much as I like this Notre Dame wide receiver room, I certainly feel like its youth and inexperience is going to catch up to it eventually. And if Riley Leonard isn't comfortable playing in this setup, then this whole thing could collapse right away. So I think it's going to be highly important to start off with a win against Texas A&M. On the road, it's going to be tough. Kyle Field's going to be rocking. There's a lot of hope surrounding this Texas A&M team, even though they don't necessarily have the players. There's a lot of hope and optimism now around Texas A&M. And I feel like if Notre Dame comes out stagnant in that game, there's really no return. In fact, if you start off 0-1, I think that's your season done as a committee member. Because there's no way blowing out Northern Illinois or Louisville is going to sway me. You have to beat the top contenders on your schedule at the end of the day if you're an independent, for me to even warrant discussing you. And that's the problem with Notre Dame. The schedule, unlike years in the recent past where you had impressive wins, the game where Ian Book really rallied that team against Clemson, you don't have those games anymore. You don't necessarily have the teams anymore who want to play you for as long as you're an independent. So you have to find ways to make wins where you're facing that level of competition really matter. You really have to find a way to blow out at least one team on the schedule in a way that might matter. Because Georgia is not playing any cupcakes this year. Texas is not playing any cupcakes this year. You see what I'm saying? At the end of the day, you have to sway me. You have to at least go undefeated to be respected as an independent. And Notre Dame, I don't necessarily think they can. That will just about do it for this show. Hope you guys enjoyed it. It's a fascinating show. I really liked it a lot, looking at all these different teams. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast and the GMC Sports Network as a whole. Consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is greatly appreciated by all involved. That will just about do it for this show. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow for our Hump Day edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.